Our speaker today is Dr. Philip Cash, who is Professor Emeritus at Emmanuel College. He's going to be talking to us today about smallpox in Boston, a complex affair. And he is also currently working on a biography of Benjamin Waterhouse. So please help me today in welcoming Dr. Philip Cash. Thank you.
The story of the struggle against smallpox in Boston is indeed a complex and a contradictory affair. It also provides excellent case studies in the application of scientific breakthroughs to societal needs and the formation of public policy in matters of health. It involves not only science and medicine, but also religion, ethics, politics, economics, class conflict, something that I don't think we handle well in the United States in studying, and personalities. It went through three phases, as most of us know. The first phase was the quarantine phase, the second was the inoculation phase, and the third was the vaccination phase. Now, quarantine was the oldest method, which did little or nothing for the victims, but when quickly and effectively employed, it lessened considerably the chances of the disease getting out of hand. Boston in the 17th century and the early 18th developed the most effective quarantine system in the colonies. This was due in large part to the fact that Boston also had the best public health system at that time. The second phase was inoculation. This was both more effective and more dangerous because, remember, you were using an attenuated version of the disease, which could easily instigate or intensify an epidemic. Now, it was well known for a long time, very long time, in both Asia and Africa, but it was virtually unknown in the Western world. It was introduced during the epidemic in June of 1721, when an epidemic was raging in Boston. And at that time, the Reverend Cotton Mather wrote a letter to Boston's 10 physicians, urging them to meet and deliberate on the question whether this largely untested procedure should be employed. He also enclosed in the letter 2 articles on the successful use of inoculation in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now, these articles have been published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of London. It's interesting, 2 things are kind of ironic there. One is the man who lent the volume to Mather was Dr. William Douglas, who was later to become his most bitter opponent. And Mather was interested in this volume because it had an article by him in it. Now, Mather was the most famous and the most important minister in Boston. He was a member of London's prestigious Royal Society, the third of only 10 colonists to be elected to this prestigious body. He was the author of a number of works on theology, history, and medicine. Indeed, he has been hailed, and I think correctly so, as the first significant figure in American medical history. He had a long-time interest in inoculation and was about as well-versed in it as anybody, and certainly in Boston. However, he received no reply from the doctors. Then he turned to Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, who had already had the disease, who agreed to try the procedure, which took great courage. Among the early inoculees was Mather's son, Thomas, and Boylston's son, John. Now, Boylston's efforts at this time clearly demonstrated vaccination's value. For instance, those who contracted smallpox in the natural way had a death rate of 14%, while those who were vaccinated, it was only a little over 2%. Hardly perfect, but a breakthrough. This was the first large-scale demonstration of the procedure's effectiveness in the Western world. Now, in all of the treatment of smallpox, there was great benefits. It was an unusual disease. First of all, it was clearly a specific entity rather than the way most diseases at that time were looked upon as generalized states. Even here, some doctors said, well, it's a phase in a generalized state. So that it had those advantages in trying to discuss it and compete over it. Now, both Mather and Boylston published their results in a pioneering effort at applying quantitative methods to a clinical procedure. Well, here's the story. Boylston and Mather are the heroes. The opponents are at best deluded, and it was a success. Not so. History is much more complicated than that. In fact, it's almost like life. Remember that the next time you read a textbook. Now, Boylston lived in the crowded Dock Square section of Boston, very crowded area. He had an apothecary shop there as well. And immediately his use of this procedure aroused a storm of protest. Very big storm. And shortly thereafter, the city's selectmen issued a cease and desist order. Boylston complied for a short time, but then, backed by a majority of the city's clergy and a number of its elite, he resumed it. So here's the ethical questions there about Boylston's. I mean, he was using a dangerous procedure, and he broke the law. His defense was that the epidemic was already raging, and one's first obligation is to one's family. Now, Mather was the leading divine in Boston and was defending the traditional right of the clergy to play a leading role in the shaping of their community. He very much belonged to the school that one's, quote, betters know better than, quote, the people. Furthermore, the clergy at this time were under a cloud and losing influence. There were two reasons for this. One was the sorry behavior of so many of them during the witchcraft craze. And the other, and I think equally important, if not more important, was the transformation of the Massachusetts Bay from a corporate colony, where the religious test for voting was the method, to a royal colony, where the property qualification was the test for voting. Now, what about the leaders of the opposition? The political ones represented the artisans and small merchants, the lower middle class of Boston, who were then the political ends. Massachusetts Bay Colony was not particularly liberal, but the city was more democratic because of the town meeting system. So they were in. Their leader was John Williams and the Board of Selectmen, and James Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's splenetic but very capable elder brother. He was the editor of a newly found newspaper for the organ of these people, the New England Courant. The leader of the professional group was Dr. William Douglas. Like so many of the outstanding doctors at that time, he was foreign-born. He was born in Scotland. He trained at Edinburgh University, Paris, and Leiden, where he received his MD. He was very much interested in science, as was Mather, and he was an excellent botanist. Later, he was wanted to publish one of the more famous volumes of American medical history, a study of the very intriguing scarlet fever epidemic of 1735, 1736. He was the best educated and the most professional of Boston's doctors at this time. He was defending the traditional right, the traditional integrity of the medical profession against lay interference. I might add that this was a much stronger concept in Europe than in America. Now, at this time, Boston had the most powerful clergy of the colonial urban centers and the least professional medical profession. Personalities also played a large role, as I think they often do. It's interesting that both of these men were learned, strong-willed, and courageous. They were also vain, combative, and opinionated. Douglas came to support vaccination, but he never forgave Mather for the way he introduced it. Now, between 1721, the epidemic of 1721, and the outbreak of the Revolution, Boston adopted a double-level policy against smallpox. The first line of defense remained the quarantine system. When epidemics broke out, inoculation was temporarily allowed. Now, remember, as I say, this was a dangerous procedure. That's one reason. The epidemic of 1752, which caused over 500 deaths, was traced to faulty inoculation. And there are those historians who claim that Boylston actually intensified the epidemic of 1721, and that's a moot question. The other was economic. Smallpox was inoculation was very costly. In those days, remember, there was a great emphasis on preparing the body to resist disease. Now, you were isolated for a period. First, you were given a special diet, rather bland diet. Then you were inoculated, and then you were isolated because you were contagious and received nursing and food. So you had the cost of the inoculation, the cost of the medicines, the cost of the nursing, the cost of the food, plus the loss of 3 weeks or more from one's job, one's occupation. Now, clearly the poor couldn't afford this, and some of the lower middle class couldn't afford it. What it was, from the time it was introduced up until almost before the Revolution, it was a benefit to the upper middle classes, but not as much a benefit for certainly the lower class and many of the lower middle class. Sound familiar? Finally, in the epidemic of 1764, 2 things were done that later, about 10 years later, allowed for inoculation on a regular basis under very strict conditions. One was that the public set up temporary inoculation hospitals. They hadn't had those before. And the second is the doctors began to realize that unless they inoculated the poor gratis and some others at a cut rate, this wasn't going to get anywhere. There wasn't going to get any farther. And, of course, the town helped with the inoculation of the poor. So that brought it about. Then we run into the final phase, vaccination. Now, vaccination was clearly superior. It was safer. It was more convenient. It was inexpensive. So it had a clear benefit over the previous 2. It was introduced to the United States by Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse, who was the professor of the theory and practice of physics at Harvard. And he was positively heroic in his efforts not only to have it accepted, but to have it spread throughout the United States and elsewhere. So he appears to be a hero, and he was, but he also had his problems. When he had the only effective vaccine in the United States, he tried to set up a vaccine trust here in New England. Now, he defended this on the grounds that he didn't want it to fall into the wrong hands and discredit it as a similar situation. There's been a similar situation in Scotland which discredited inoculation for a number of years. But reading and studying Dr. Waterhouse more closely, you realize that there were 2 more important motives. One was money, and the other was revenge. When Dr. Waterhouse arrived in the United States, back into the United States in May of 1782, he came back as the best educated American physician, native-born American physician, up until that time. He also had good contacts in both London's scientific and medical societies. He had studied at Edinburgh, which was considered the leading medical school in the Western world. He had walked the wards of St. Thomas's Hospital and taken London's famous medical courses. London was much more, remember, London didn't have a university. London was much more famous for its medical courses than its hospitals actually at that time. There were about 15 courses given at any one time in various aspects of medicine. So it had a double, you had to walk in the wards and the courses. And he did all this under the patronage of his mother's cousin, who was the most famous and influential doctor in London at that time, Dr. John Fothergill. So he had open access to a vast array of medical and scientific talent. Now, he came back, and Harvard recognized that if their medical school was going to be anything other than a small and poor provincial institute, Waterhouse's credentials were badly needed. Sorry, John Warren. He was the one that gave credibility. He was the only one that had a medical degree. He's the only one that studied abroad. He's the only one that had studied beyond the apprenticeship level. I might point out, however, that both Dexter and Warren did have a considerable amount of military medical experience, which at this time was the second most important for him. Very important. You could meet doctors from different countries. You could see hospitals, which some of them never had, surgery, see a number of diseases. So that's a factor to keep in. Nonetheless, when you look at the other two medical schools at that time, at what is now Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania, almost all their teachers had medical degrees and had studied abroad. So they were very anxious to keep him, and they did everything they could to keep him. However, Boston's doctors did not feel anywhere near the same way. They felt very threatened, especially since the upheaval of the Revolutionary War had diminished the number of doctors who had studied abroad and greatly increased those who had only apprentice training plus military, most of them, military medical experience. Now, Boston has never been, at least in my studies, a welcoming city. But when you have a threatening figure coming in, the large majority of Boston doctors want to get rid of this guy as quickly as possible. And they did everything they could to drive him out of Boston. They boycotted him. Believe it or not, he was turned down in his first application for admission to the Massachusetts Medical Society, and he was not allowed into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences until 1795, and then only on certain agreed upon but unstated reservations. Finally, he had to leave Boston. In 1787, he moved to the place, took a few years, but he moved to the place, as you know, probably on Waterhouse Street, where the Hotel Commander and the Commons is their fine home, which Harvard bought and charged him only the interest on the loan to buy it. Okay, you couldn't make enough money. No doctor made enough money out of teaching at Harvard at that time. It's a small school. He graduated only 53 students. They have MBs and MDs, only 53 students by 1810. Of the 650 medical students at the three medical schools in 1800, 406 were at the University of Pennsylvania, which is clearly the country's leading medical school. So he was badly in need of money, and he had a chance to gain revenge on his tormentors, his medical tormentors. So he was not unalloyed virtue, if there is such a thing. And again, it's interesting that he had a personality very similar to Dr. Douglas and Cotton Mather. Well, now we get the vaccination. It's spread around the country. It's clearly superior, no question. End of story. No. During the first half of the 19th century, Boston underwent no less than 6 epidemics. Why? Well, one thing was the decline in the use of vaccination, out of sight, out of mind. People said it's not around, and as a result, whereas earlier the number of non-immunes was going down, now they were going up. And that was certainly unwise. And the second was that most of these outbreaks were confined to the urban slums. Again, out of sight, out of mind. One of the most grim statistics I've seen in the history of Boston medicine is by Lemuel Shattuck in his report in the 1840s. He seems to have shown that the median age of death of Boston's Irish was 1/2. That is, the native-born Americans lived twice as long as the Irish immigrants. Okay, now the interesting thing, this same pattern was found throughout the rest of the country. Until by the 1850s, smallpox was a major threat once more. And ironically, at that time, it was resisted, there was enormous resistance to compulsory vaccination. It was headed by a coalition of libertarians, people who didn't believe it didn't work. The manufacturers of patent drugs who wanted nothing to do with government regulation, and a number of the medical irregulars. And this resistance came down well into the 20th century, resistance to compulsory vaccination. I remember when I was a kid, in the 1930s, not the 1830s, the 1930s, my mother and my uncle, who was the school physician, used to have big arguments about the wisdom of vaccination. So, and Boston fitted in with this. For instance, 1838, Massachusetts repealed a law that required the smallpox patients be isolated in special hospitals, the height of Jacksonian. To show what happened, between 1811 and 1838, 52 persons in Boston had died of smallpox. Between 1838 and 1864, 1,491 did. By the way, no less than 10 legislatures in the 1850s and 60s either repealed prohibition, the compulsory vaccination laws, or defeated bills introduced to impose it. And they're scattered throughout the country. In Boston, it was in Massachusetts, it was no easy victory. Now, in 1855, Boston passed the first mandatory school vaccination law in the United States, so they did buck the trend somewhat. Between 1859 and 1702, Boston suffered from 3 more epidemics. In 1859, it killed 318 people, 40% of whom were under the age of 5. The biggest epidemic was in 1872, 1873, in which there were over 1,000 deaths. The last epidemic was in 1902, when there were 1,024 who suffered from the disease and 190 deaths. Well, it's been over a century since we've had a smallpox epidemic. Want to think about another century? Don't bet on it. Viral diseases. The public is blissfully aware. We found 30 new viral diseases in the past 20 years. And the conditions grow more favorable every day because of 2 reasons. In 1850, there were 1 billion people. They are now pushing 7 billion, which gives them many more hopes. In 1850, it took between 250 and 300 days to go around the world. Now it's 24 hours, or less. And you also have mass movements of population, either for labor purposes or for fleeing persecution. So I don't know. It's not a cheery note, but I think it's, if you're going to live near a volcano, well, at least know you're living near a volcano. Well, I guess that's it. I'll open up to any questions anyone has. Yes.
Professor, if it was my understanding, what is the difference between inoculation and vaccination? To me, they go hand in hand, but you have indicated there were 3 steps, one of which was each of those categories. So could you tell us what the difference is?
Well, that's a very good question. I should have brought that up. They both are inoculation in the sense you puncture, but not to confuse them, we generally use inoculation when you use the attenuated for smallpox. Whereas vaccination, smallpox is an interesting disease, not only because of its distinctive symptoms, but the only time in the history of medicine that I know of where one virus developed immunity to another virus, the vaccine virus. By the way, the Russians, when they were doing that germ warfare, they were trying to, and I suspect a lot of other countries do, they were trying to manipulate the smallpox virus to resist vaccination. So the difference is that one was one virus attacking the other virus. The other one was giving an attenuated version, like polio was at the beginning, of the disease. So you're right, they both were inoculation, but to make the distinction, most historians speak of vaccination and inoculation. Okay?
Did George Washington require vaccination during the Revolutionary War of the Soldiers?
Yeah, that was one of the great public health victories in American history. When he was here, when he came to take over the army besieging Boston, he couldn't do that because you would lose too many soldiers, possibly, because of the chances that would intensify an outbreak or intensification. He isolated them, and he kept the army. He was a wonderful public health man. Most great generals kept their armies clean, move, exercise, and so that actually the only one I know of the greatest generals, Caesar and people like that, was Alexander the Great. He didn't seem to give a damn about anything except his divinity. But yes, so after the siege of Boston lifted, he had the soldiers inoculated, and he had any new recruits coming in. That was hard to control with the militia, but it was certainly true of the Continental Army. And it's a great achievement. It's one of the great achievements of American medical history that there were no outbreaks of it. Yes?
Much has been made in some circles about the spread of smallpox among many American Indian tribes, for example.
Yes.
Were epidemics spreading in the Euro population as well?
Yes, but there was more public health in Europe than there was in the United States at this time. Jacksonian democracy did not hit. The European Americans was the... well, what I said, there were some outbreaks, but no. The thing, getting back to the Indian thing, it's very interesting. I've often wondered as a kid, and I said, how did a group of Spaniards, a few hundred with horses and swords, defeat one of the most military powerful peoples in the world, the Aztecs? There were 2 reasons. One reason was that the Aztecs were very brutal, and they were only recently entrenched, about 60 years, I think, before Cortez came here. So other tribes joined the Spaniards. But the big thing was smallpox. The population of Mexico in the 16th century declined by 85 or 90%. If you want to see the closest thing to a Holocaust, you want to study a closer thing to a Holocaust, study the situations when an infectious organism strikes a new population. And that was the most important, I think, in defeating the Indians. It was sometimes done deliberately. General Bouquet in the French and Indian War gave the traders with the Indians, blankets that had been exposed to smallpox. So it was deliberate, yes.
Can you tell us any more about, you mentioned something done in Constantinople. Was that by alchemists, or was that...
No. It was by, they used the vaccination. The different tribes, they had come up with a pretty good system of vaccination there, using the attenuated version. And the British legation there was kind of interested in that, particularly Lady Mary Wortley Montague, who was the wife of the ambassador there. So the Chinese used to do it for way back. What they would do is they would take scabs and pound it up and blow it up the nose. The Indian from India used to wrap their children in smallpox blankets because they wanted to develop, either die or be immune. That was well true. But they used the same procedure, essentially, that Boylston used.
And when was that?
In 1721.
Oh.
So there had been a few. Mary Wortley Montague had 6 convicts. See, convicts and children were the great people for experimenting on. And she had six convicts inoculated, and then later given the smallpox. They didn't get it. Then she had her children. She had suffered from it, so she was a beautiful woman, but she had some scars due to that.
On these inoculations, vaccinations, was there any resemblance in the way they would do it? Do they have, in other words, do they have needles with the material in it, or do they cut with a knife? Or
what they did is how did they inoculate or vaccinate? It was by needle puncture. What happened as time went by, they began to take unripened pustule matter from that and stick it in. That proved to be effective too and less dangerous. They also made shallower punctures. See, the big danger was not only that you would spread smallpox, but you would infect. If you didn't, a lot of things went in besides the smallpox vaccine went into the wound and caused infections, a lot of infections. By the way, smallpox accounted for a great deal of the blindness in colonial America, the blindness and deafness. Because with a bad attack, their eyes would go blind. But they stuck it in, just usually. Where would you stick it in? Generally in both arms, then later in one arm. Cotton Mather had an interesting theory. Cotton Mather was a curious person. He said this was not a scientific thought. This is really more of a speculative thought. He said the reason why inoculation works is when you get it in the natural way, it tends to come through the throat and nose, which is absolutely right, and therefore it gets closer, it's quick to get to the organs, the vital organs. But if you inoculate in the limbs, the body's able to develop a resistance and wouldn't do that much damage. He had the right idea, but it was not a scientific idea. But he had a pretty good idea. Most people at that time thought diseases were due to bad air. malaria. But he was one of the ones that believed that disease was, he and John Adams actually, believed that disease was caused by little worms, invisible worms. That was an old theory. It wasn't new, but I mean, he was a fairly sophisticated thinker, enormously credulous at the same time.